And the broad outlines of the deal, as you can imagine, is that you give us Tim Tams, we give you penguins, you give us Vegemite, we give you Marmite.
A world where governments were celebrating freer trade in people and goods seems a long time ago. In June 2021, Boris Johnson and Scott Morrison announced a UK-Australia free trade deal. One part of the deal is central to a fraught Australian political debate in 2025.
Australia also agreed to make it easier for British backpackers to stay in Australia on working holiday visas for up to 3 years. There are now about 55,000 UK working holiday makers in Australia.
The policy levers that determine how many people come to Australia are often invisible to the public. International students get a lot of attention, but researcher and author Peter Mayers points out there are now around 59 bilateral agreements covering the movement of people to and from Australia. 18 countries were added during the Coalition's last term in office alone. Those agreements create a problem if there is a political push to cut migration numbers.
So if we were going to say, no, we're not having any more working holiday makers from the United States or Germany or France or Japan or whatever, we'd be breaking a bilateral agreement with that country. It sounds a bit like we'd be behaving like Donald Trump and ignoring the agreements we've signed.
It is overwhelmingly temporary visas rather than permanent migration that make up the big migration numbers that dominate the political debate. International students, working holiday makers and workers coming on temporary skilled visas dominate the numbers and aren't really under the control of government. As long as there is a place for you to study, a bilateral agreement or an employer who wants you, you can come to Australia for several years. But do we actually need to cut migration? Do we actually have a migration crisis?
So before COVID in 2019, that is in the back in black budget, the government forecast net overseas migration at 270,000 per annum. During COVID, that fell sharply. Then after COVID, the coalition government stomped on the immigration accelerator. Net migration boomed to over 500,000, a level we've never seen in our history. It then declined last financial year to about 445,000. This year, it's projected to hit about 335,000, and next year, Treasury is forecasting 260,000.
The borders reopened and we saw a huge surge of temporary migrants coming back in, particularly students, but also others. And that was deliberately encouraged by Morrison-era policies because there was a fear that we wouldn't get those students back.
In its first 2 years, the government brought in 1 million people through the migration program. That's 70% more migrants than in any 2-year period in Australia's history.
Labor in government was probably a bit slow to see that we were overshooting, but the problems we've been experiencing are really about the huge drop and then surge in migration numbers rather than about the overall numbers over time.
The main measure of migration used in the political debate is net overseas migration, the total number of people who arrive and depart from Australia each year. It includes permanent and temporary migrants. The most recent target for annual permanent migration was 185,000. Net overseas migration is this year estimated at around 335,000. Researchers at ANU's Migration Hub say that net overseas migration had added 31,000 fewer people than would have been the case if migration had stayed at the levels projected in 2019. And they say the numbers are still heading down as more people on temporary visas have to leave.
Employers and others called for compassion towards people who are stuck in the country, called for extensions to cover the skills shortages and labour shortages that happened because of the pandemic. And we still haven't seen those visa extensions and extended durations expire. Basically, we've caught up now and migration is falling really fast. In 2 to 3 years, we expect it to fall more because the visa extensions will come to an end.
So despite the political noise, overall migration numbers are not all that different to what they would have been if there had not been a pandemic. That hasn't stopped a shift in political sentiment. The ABC's Vote Compass found around 49% of people now want fewer migrants compared to 2022, when the same number wanted more. And both sides of politics have pledged to cut migration.
We will lower the permanent migration program by 25% for 2 years. We will reduce net overseas migration in our first year by 100,000 relative to Labor.
The Albanese government trimmed the permanent migration target for the year just ending from 190,000 to 185,000. It has moved to cut the overall net overseas migration numbers by making it harder for international students to get visas.
The Labor government has promised that net migration in 25-26 will fall to 260,000. I don't think the 260,000 for next financial year can be delivered. I suspect an outcome closer to 300,000 would be more sensible to forecast. Mr Dutton is saying he can bring net migration next year down to apparently 160,000. I think Mr Dutton's target of 160,000 is just about impossible.
Cutting permanent migration is just as hard, if not harder, than cutting temporary visa numbers. Former Immigration Department Deputy Secretary Abul Rizvi says there are particular problems cutting permanent migration numbers because of a backlog in the family stream of permanent migration, which by law cannot have a cap on it.
The backlog of partner visas increased quite dramatically last financial year, and the application rate, I understand, has remained very high. That means that the backlog just keeps growing. I think the backlog by the end of this financial year will be over 90,000.
You can't say to an Australian citizen or resident, sorry, we've got too many immigrants, you have to wait 3 years until you can marry your husband or wife.
The politics of such a cut are a nightmare, which is why, despite declaring the coalition would cut migration by 25%, Peter Dutton has not only failed to say which visa classes might be cut, but has indicated he won't say until after the election.
We'll take that advice when we get into government.
The only permanent visa category he said will not be touched is parents. A housing crisis that has been building for decades has been a major factor sparking the shift in sentiment against migration in the last 3 years.
We've hit this realisation that housing is unaffordable, and that's a real problem. And unfortunately, that's put migration in the crosshairs in terms of a policy solution, whereas actually it's not the best policy solution if you want to tackle housing cost. The best way to tackle housing cost is to build more homes.
Analysts like Alan Gamlin argue it is the local population which has more of an impact on prices in the housing market than migrants.
Native-born people are more likely to buy homes, they're more likely to have access to credit, they're more likely to have family help with finances, they're more likely to be the people who are buying a first home.
That's not to say increasing the population doesn't affect the housing market, but in the past 20 years we have shifted from mainly permanent migration to temporary arrivals. That has ramifications for the sort of housing that's in demand. A lot more rentals than purchases, and often cheaper accommodation than permanent arrivals might want. And the huge number of people living here without the prospect of settling permanently has a lot of other social implications too.
One of the things that Australia did really well in the 80s and 90s compared to, say, parts of Europe is that we didn't run a guest worker system. When people moved to Australia, they were new Australians. So it meant that they were not only working in jobs where they were needed, but they were raising their family and integrating into the community with the confidence that they had the right to vote. They were able to participate fully in the community and in public life. A move towards a more temporary or guest worker system, it loses that.
This is part of another discussion about the changing nature of migration and therefore our society that we haven't been having in the heat of debate in the last few years. But given the crucial role migration has played in our economic development, we probably should.
We spend a lot of time talking about, the things we dig out of the ground, but really migration has been an absolute economic boon for Australia. But not just economic in a kind of like numbers in a GDP sense, it is the fabric of our society.